Welcome to another episode of Iron Culture. This is Omar Isaf, one of the hosts. I'm joined by my co-host Eric Helms. Today, we're discussing supplement science. The function of this introduction is in order to introduce the guests. The two guests today are Ben Esgro and Dr. Eric Trexler.
My name is Eric Helms, Dr. Eric Helms, specifically to state my qualification and relevance to the podcast as an expert on most things nutrition and exercise. I am joining my co-host Omar Isaf. We have removed banter from our introductions so as to produce more high-quality ratings and remove wasted time. For those who want purely information, please give us a 5-star rating because of us adhering to your demands. Next, in this section, we will have the actual podcast, which includes our interview with Eric Trexler, Dr. Eric Trexler specifically, a supplement researcher and expert in the area of applied and mechanistic research as it functions in relation to supplements, and also Ben Esgro, a supplement company owner and formulator and expert in the areas of pharmacology and nutrition. He is also a registered dietitian.
I'm so glad we could begin an episode without the slightest bit of controversy. We're joined actually with two guests that have been here before. Ben Esgro, who was on our episode where we talked about supplement companies and how it's lovely incurring a massive debt to pursue that which you love. Weirdly enough, I would say, Ben, you were quite illuminating in your speaking. I felt that we didn't give you enough time, and I don't know if it was myself and Eric where we usually are the culprit, or it just seemed like, there's a lot of talking going on in that episode, but we wanted to bring you back, my man, and give you the platform because I think there's a lot of very good insight that you could talk about. Before we do, there's just Eric Helms, of course. When I say Eric, there's just the tiniest bit of housekeeping we have to bring up here before we begin. And that is, of course, we have returning for this episode, Eric Trexler. He says his name is Eric Trexler. He is the host of Stronger by Science, a podcast that I've heard a handful of people listen to. Before we begin, Eric, I'm just very curious, and sorry, I should say Eric Trexler or just T-Rex, I'll refer to make it clear that I'm not referring to, designation 1 Eric Helms. Recently I saw on someone's post is Massonomics, I believe is the IG handle. They had a list of the best podcast out there. And it was quite an outstanding group. You had Starting Strength, and a few others. I'm honestly blanking on the others, but I noticed Stronger by Science was on there. And I just want to say, of course, congratulations. But if I'm being frank, I thought it was a little fucked up that you didn't extend the hand down for everyone else. We're like, obviously, and it is noted that actually 5 or 6 people said in the comment sections, what about Iron Culture? And of course, Eric Trexler toned the company line of just only promoting their own work, didn't mention it, wasn't like, oh yeah, our buddies, I kind of work with Eric Helms all the time, massive monthly application strength sports. He basically introed me to this game. Nah, I'm not going to mention it. I'm just going to take this W and not, mention anything else. And so people were obviously upset. I've been told that I should start referring to you as Judas. I'm not going to do that because I want to add another name to your name, if you don't mind, because that's what we do here. So it's not Darren, it's not Eric, it's just Judas. And then the second one, we're bringing you on, and Helms doesn't know this. Helms is my boy. He's my ride or die. I love you, baby. But when it came time for my little company to formulate a multivitamin, of course, Helms is coming in, swinging in my favor. Let me shout out Ben Esgro right here because Ben has another company. And meanwhile, Helms is like, hey, yo, Ben, can you help my homie out, Omar? He wants to do some of that informed sports third-party testing. Ben's like, yo, for sure. And he lets me know in an email, this is a true story. Ben's the man. Of course, Ben's, and that is a true story. Seriously, props to Ben. And it's relevant to our discussion. So this is not only banter, it's informative. And then Helms, of course, when he knows I want to make a multivitamin, he's like, Omar, I got you. Of course, we want that hierarchy of evidence. We want someone that knows what they're talking about. My man, Eric Trexler, I know he's going to do you a solid. So he intros me to this guy, Trexler, who I've heard a lot about, this other natural bodybuilder, PhD, blah, blah, blah. And I just get flat out rejected. And he cites the fact that he was completing his PhD and it was the worst time of his life to try and do something like this. And so I think the real name, if I could quote my boy Bill Shakespeare, A2 Brute, would be Judas Brutus Trexler. I want to introduce returning to another episode. So I don't know if you want to say anything, T-Rex, before we begin,
Well, that was certainly the longest introduction that I've ever had. That's for sure. I would have brought you up when it comes to the podcast list, but you have no idea the obscene amounts of money we paid to get on that list. And to waste all that money by bringing you in for free would have been a terrible investment. So that's the beginning and end of that story. And when it comes to your vitamin, I'm very selective about the people I do business with, and I'll leave it there.
Okay. Yeah. I appreciate that. I think for the rest of this conversation, T-Rex, we're probably going to have a 2-hour conversation about pain, attempting to define it, if that's okay with you.
That'd be great.
Eric, my man, Mr. Helms, Sir Helms, over to you.
Yeah, honestly, I think sometimes you just have to accept things as philosophical differences.
Yeah.
I remember when we first brought, Dr. Trexler onto Mass, and I said, hey, man, this is great. I know we both have similar names. I know we both have a similar resume. I don't see this as a weakness. I see it as a strength. And I started to say, as the great saying, a rising tide lifts all. And he says, lifts the water above your competitors' heads so they drown because you stabbed their ship with holes. And I said, that seems like a really long, circuitous saying, Eric. Are you sure that's what it is? And he slapped me in the face. So I think it's just a minor difference in a worldview. And I've been brought up to respect that. So I think that's okay. I'm not hurt. It hurt, but I'm not, hurt. I don't blame anyone. It's just, I'm a drowning man and he stepped on my head. And here we are.
Well, Helms, from the pain episode that myself and Trexler did, and he did a fantastic job, we found out that sometimes pain can be pleasurable. So maybe that slap wasn't the worst, where someone brought up BDSM. And so if we weren't already going to get, banned or explicit for this episode, I just wanted to make sure, because Ben Esgro, my boy, doesn't know this, but we're actually currently fighting with, Sex with Dr. Emily. So we just brought a bunch of doctors on board for this one to really leverage that. And you thought we're going to talk about supplement science. Like, Ben fully came prepared, and this is why he's the man with an outline. He's like, this is what I want to talk about. I want to talk about formulations. I want to talk about a drug versus supplement. What's the process look like? And we're like, oh, that's cute. And then, here we are.
Yeah.
But I'm going to throw you this curveball. I didn't tell you about the alternative delivery methods. So usually supplements are only oral, but we can go down that path if we talk about the alternative delivery methods. So don't count me out just yet.
Transdermal, right? No? Is that not it? Transdermal, right?
Oh, no. No, I was talking about, you could do the enema. That's always a delivery method.
Oh, right. Now I see why that's risque. I was like, transdermal. But I get excited by strange things. So in all seriousness, I'm sure we've lost about a solid 20% of our listeners at this point.
The weakest 20.
The good news is they can't hear us now talk crap about them. Like, you should have left. We're glad you're gone. Everyone else who hung around, guess what? You won the prize. What's the prize? Hearing about the actual episode. So today what we're going to be talking about is a behind-the-scenes look on what goes on in the terms of formulation of supplements from someone who does that, who is an expert in that, and also how we go about validating the utility in empirical science of supplements and what that process looks like. And then what is the actual output? How do we consider that? When we look at research on supplements, how do we know the veracity of it, whether it's something we can trust? And when should we actually pull the trigger and put into cart, check out, ship to my address? I'll have Brandon edit out my address, which I'm going to say now. And then that aspect, I think, will be covered by Dr. Trexler. So, without further ado, Ben, I want you to tell us, what's the difference between, say, a drug and supplements? Like, what defines what you do versus what my man down in the alley does when I need a hookup?
Yeah, that's a different kind of drug as well, though. But I'm going to do my best to kind of be all encompassing with that. So, when you're studying the effects of any compound, ideally, you're trying to look into the mechanisms of drug action. So that actually does apply to supplements as well. And I'll get a little bit into that in a bit. But at the most simple starting point, in 1994, there was a bill passed. It was DSHEA. It was Dietary Supplements, Health and Education Act. And that basically defined that supplements they can be botanicals, they can be amino acids, they can be purified vitamins or minerals, and they can be extracts, They can be metabolites of pretty much anything within that category, but they can't be isolated individual compounds. So, for example, you can take something like St. John's wort, but if you isolate the one component of St. John's wort and put that in a pill, now it's a drug. So that obviously opens up a very wide array, because now you're talking about botanicals, which is its own area, and then you're also talking about things like amino acids, which all fit underneath the category of supplements. The other thing that Deshay outlined is that you need to be clear in not defining that the supplement that you're pitching is a treatment for or a cure for any disease. So that's sort of the most fundamental starting point. But actually, in researching and developing, I've sort of taken a lot of the methods of drug development and started to apply them to formulation. And that's just a trend that we kind of see happening with the supplement industry becoming more sort of tight-knit, more regulated, just because as time develops, you see the stuff with, banned substances kind of falling into two batches of products. And that's just more and more on the radar. So I think ultimately it's going in that direction. Like, we all remember where GMP kind of became a thing, which is good manufacturing practices. And just to refer back originally to my original point, that was ultimately what they were trying to enact with Deshay was. I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
You're allowed to. No big deal. The purpose of Deshay? Does that help?
I lost it. It was sorry. Too many.
I do have a side question, Ben, that might be relevant to the conversation you were just having. Just to maybe set up the fact that can you introduce the landscape maybe for us when it comes to the supplement industry? You've been involved in it for over 10 years. Why these things are a good idea in the first place? Where, I've heard superficially, obviously, protein spiking or tainted supplements. I know Trexler actually had an article about that, I believe, on Stronger by Science, just discussing part of that process. What did it look like when you entered? Like, why are these, I guess, for the uninformed consumer, just to leapfrog off of that, why are some of these things important? Because as an outsider, it's like, oh man, yeah, there's like 100 different supplements on, the wall.
Sure. I think there's a lot of reasons. One is that you ultimately want to know what you're getting. And I think previous to this sort of transition that happened, it was a lot more common to actually see pharmaceuticals find their way in. I remember a company that starts with a G that was very popular, that was putting in prescription anti-estrogens into their testosterone boosters. There was things like clenbuterol getting into fat burners, stuff like that. So it's multiple ends. Number one is, if you don't know that you're taking something that's that potent, you obviously run that much larger of a risk. I think people also have this inherent idea of, because it's a supplement, it's more natural. That means it's safer, so I could take more of it. And obviously, if there's pharmaceuticals in there, which are orders of magnitude more potent, you don't have that type of safety margin. So it is partly a safety thing, and then it's also the thing, the part of the regulation of the governing body that you compete in. Obviously, if you're a competitor and you think you're taking something that's clean, and then you find out later, too late, that you've tested positive for some kind of pharmaceutical, that's obviously a major red flag too.
Can I ask you? I'll open this up to both of you, because I know I've heard you talk about this before, Eric, with one of your guests on your podcast. Is it accurate to say that the supplement industry is almost post hoc regulated? That there's an assumption like, hey, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and the FDA is going to, at least in the United States, I should say, is going to stay out of your hair until maybe a problem arises? Or is that an unfair characterization?
Ben, why don't you start?
So that's why I wanted to bring up Deshay. Is actually, prior to 94, supplements were regulated the same way as food products were. So FDA actually would have some type of process in controlling that. So in a way, actually, Deshay was deregulation of the industry, and it basically said the responsibility is on the part of the company to provide that. So they don't actually intervene unless there are adverse events that become a large enough number for them to actually intervene and step in. So yeah, it's complicated. I'll let Trexler jump in there because I can probably go back and forth with myself for 10 minutes.
Yeah. So Helms, as you mentioned, I talked to Rick Collins a little bit about this on our podcast, and he's a really, really good lawyer that does a lot of work in the realm of dietary supplements and steroids. And, the way that he described it to me and the way that Deshay's written, it is kind of a post-market regulation process, much like Ben was getting at, where, if you're putting a supplement on the market and it, generally contains things that are already kind of out there on the market and known to be out there on the market, you can pretty much put it out there. The only time you really have to give any kind of notification is if you're introducing what they consider a new dietary ingredient. But, Deshay, the way it was written, it's got some wiggle room in there. And Rick is awesome. I love him. He's a lawyer, so I kept using the term loopholes, and he said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! They're exemptions." So he was killing me with that. But there are these exemptions, right? And so if you could theoretically make the claim that you qualify for one of these exemptions, it seems that a lot of companies like to do so, and that's not necessarily a nefarious thing. I mean, you can think of people in any number of different fields and industries who are like, do I want to get a government regulatory body involved here, or would I rather just go to market? Of course, anyone would be like, I don't think I'm doing anything wrong, but like, I don't need the extra headaches, right? So it's not necessarily a nefarious thing, but there is some wiggle room in there where even if you have a borderline ingredient that you're like, this might qualify for one of these exemptions, it might not. You do see a lot of those. They kind of just say, no, I'm exempt. I don't have to file that notification. I'm going to go ahead and get on the market without providing that NDI notification. And, one of the issues there is, like Ben was saying, sometimes we do see, there's the cases of just pure adulteration, right? Where pharmaceuticals are just finding their way into products. They're not on the label. And it's like, okay, you're just doing bad stuff. But there are instances of kind of sliding a new ingredient into the market, but saying, no, that's not really a new dietary ingredient because it meets a number of exemptions. And then we'll start to see instances where it's like, right, but that kind of newish dietary ingredient that you essentially introduced to the market, now we're starting to see some adverse events getting reported, and now we start looking into it. And so it's one of those things like you were getting at, Helms, where it happens kind of long after the fact, right? So it's been on the market for 3 years. There have been a number of adverse events. And now the FDA would say, oh, maybe it's time to take a look at that. And a lot of people who are like, consumers of supplements are like, what's happening? How did this take so long? People have been selling this for 4 years. So it's a really fascinating landscape when it comes to some of those nuances of the regulatory processes.
So can we go down the rabbit hole a little bit here? Because I think there's some really interesting practical points to spin off of that. Are you guys okay with that?
Ben, our podcast is just a bunch of rabbit holes. There's nothing else.
You should know, Ben. So. Yeah. We were gonna call this podcast Critiques of Capitalism. Of course, there are some that would say the market, of course, corrects itself. And, we are fans on this podcast of unfettered corporate capitalism. We believe, once again, that corporations do their best to serve the people. So we'll listen to what both of you have to say about these loopholes or exemptions or putting clenbuterol in supplements. Like, that's a bad thing. People don't want to get massively yacked, but go ahead, Ben.
I just want to point out that Omar is clearly from Canada, and I'll just leave it at that. You go ahead.
Well, and just the American perspective, you said corporations do good things for people. I would say corporations are people, and some of the best people, in my opinion.
Well said. Well said. I was just recently having lunch with Mr. MacBook earlier, so yeah.
Very good. But Ben, I think you were going to talk about supplements.
Yeah. So there's actually some interesting naturally occurring things that fit exactly what Dr. Trexler was talking about. One of them is actually red yeast rice, which you may have heard of. And red yeast rice, because of the fermentation process, it naturally produces lovastatin. Lovastatin is a statin. It's a cholesterol lowering drug. So technically it can be sold as a supplement because lovastatin is one component of hundreds or thousands in red yeast rice. But the moment you isolate it and only have lovastatin, now it's a drug. So hopefully that kind of maybe paints a more clear picture from where I was starting to get in the beginning. But what that opens up is an entire arena of creative freedom for someone who's either bright enough with chemistry or knows enough of where to kind of go in and where to hide potentially. Because what typically happens, you guys mentioned that it's sort of post hoc regulation. And what will usually happen is, and this happened with 1,3-dimethylamine, where they said it's a natural component of geranium oil and no one could ever find it. So you can take synthetically produced in either a lab in China or a lab in America. They'll make it pure. You mix it in. Number one, now you've put it into a mixture of compounds. So the probability of a consumer saying, that's 1,3-dimethylamine in there, like I know it, I can feel it, or I can smell it, is never going to happen. Usually an adverse event's going to happen first. Then it needs to be analyzed. There's complications in analysis because what you need to do is you need to separate all of those compounds out, and sometimes they don't separate out so well. So there's the challenge of analytical. They need to know they're looking for that. And if it's something new, which also happened with what Dr. Trexler talked about with anabolics, previously in the prohormone era, what creative chemists would do is they'd structurally manipulate DHEA, which DHEA was legal. If you change a couple of the atoms or a couple of the orientations, you now have something that doesn't fit anywhere legally, and it's much harder to look for it because you don't have an analytical test built to find that specific compound. So it almost becomes this weird looking for a needle in a haystack thing, and that's why there's this delay. So usually something bad needs to happen, and usually unique effects will occur. A supplement will get really popular, wildly popular. That actually happened with Craze. And then they'll need to sort of find out the events and then find the test to find it and confirm it's there. So there are a lot of challenges in that. And it's weird because there's one side of me that loves that openness, that creative openness. And then there's the other side of me that realizes how much unfiltered openness can let in a lot of dirt or junk too. And it's always this sort of, I think, evolving process in the supplement industry. Is like that hasn't gone away. In my opinion, it's just rotated to something new, which is more stimulant based, less anabolic based.
So Ben, I imagine the positive aspect of this openness is probably what drove you towards doing your master's in, is it pharmacological sciences or pharmacology? Or neither one.
It's pharmaceutical chemistry, but primarily it's pharmacology. So I didn't actually make any compounds. It was a lot of the pharmacy, the mechanisms of things. But
that's exactly what's. Sorry to cut you off there. But that's exactly where I see. If you understand something like, hey, we get these statins from red yeast rice. Then you can kind of look at all the different drugs that are out there that might have an effect that you could see would be marketable or useful for whatever goal you're trying to get. And if you understand the pharmacology of it and how they got to that compound, then you can just kind of go up that production stream until you find something that could be legally considered a supplement and build something around that. Is that kind of your angle? Totally.
So I think, let's just say in the never-ending search for novelty, I feel like I'm always fighting both the industry and myself. And I think I got to a point where I realized, okay, this nutrition degree and RD and stuff have helped me, but they've only gotten me a certain point of the way there. I still don't. I remember bodybuilding.com forums where they'd be those people talking about, the chemistry or the pharmacology of these supplements, and then Patrick Arnold, chemists who were actually doing these manipulations. And I knew if I was ever going to innovate to a level that people like they were, I needed to kind of go the next step for myself too. So yeah, what happened in the process and what evolved it is I'm trying to find that happy middle ground where yes, it's novel, but I can still tie it to some human data, or I can at least find a way there through mechanisms or through being herbs that have been used for hundreds, thousands of years. Like, I'm not introducing brand new compounds, because then that goes back to, again, what Dr. Trexler was saying, is then you need an NDI, then you actually get stuff involved, and that does become a very hairy situation if you're not a massive conglomerate and you can't afford those trials, because they can get very expensive.
So you've now, through the evolution of your education and experience, you went from getting your master's in nutrition, your RD, and understanding that side of it, which I would argue is the applied side of what you do, to then going back and now understanding the mechanistic side of it, so that you can track things back. Now, I think this is a really interesting juxtaposition to how things are done in the research world for validating supplements. There are studies that look at the mechanism of something, like, is there some kind of physiological rationale as to why this could have an effect? Does it work in an animal model? Does it work in vitro versus in vivo? Does it work on one specific pathway if we can isolate it? And then also there's the studies where it's like, yeah, we got these dudes, we gave them a fake thing, and then we gave them a thing, and then we saw whether they got leaner or stronger in the other one. So Dr. Trexler, I know you've been involved in research related to some supplements, and of course we review supplement research in mass. So how do you see the whole applied versus mechanistic side of things? When you were evaluating a study on a supplement, what do you need to see before you have some confidence in that outcome?
Well, I like the way you frame that of, you've got the basic mechanistic research and the applied research. And based on my background, one might think I have a bias where I'm like, well, just show me the applied stuff, right? But I can tell you for certain, I've seen supplement trials where I will see the applied result that's attributed to the supplement, and there is no realistic mechanism identified for how it would be eliciting that type of effect. And you have to keep in mind, a lot of these applied supplement trials are in very small groups of people. I mean, these are small sample sizes, and an easy way, without getting out a whiteboard and doing all the formulas, an easy way to think about small sample research and its limitations is take out a coin. You're going to flip it 4 times. You should get heads twice, but it's only 4 flips. I mean, you could get heads 4 times, or you could get heads once. And with a small group of flips, you don't really have a lot of confidence that you're getting down to the true ratio of how many heads and tails I should be getting in the real world on any given flip. Now, if we do a set of 4 flips, and then another and another and another, and then all of a sudden we have 50,000 flips worth of these groups of 4, then we get to a spot where we can say, okay, that ended up being pretty even between heads and tails, right? But any one of those clusters of 4 could look ridiculous. It could be 4-0. So you have to be really careful with these small trials. Like a supplement like caffeine, for example, you'll look at one study and it'll say, well, caffeine was, improved upper body performance, but not lower body. And then you look at another study and it says the exact opposite. And that's I can give you 2 studies that show either one of those. And I think people reading research see that, and it causes a lot of frustration, because there's a tendency, we see that one finding that says caffeine improves upper body performance but not lower body, and we take it as fact and say, what's happening in the upper body that's different than the lower body? What's this mechanism? In reality, we have to take several steps back and say, let's wait until we've got 25 trials with hundreds and hundreds of people in total. Then we can start to pick apart if there's something different going on with upper body and lower body. So that was a long-winded way of basically saying, like, the applied stuff is important, but we need the mechanistic stuff behind it. And so, your question to me originally was, what do I need to see as a researcher before I start saying, okay, there's some promise here? For me to get there, I have to see, first of all, there's got to be a mechanism. If there's not a mechanism, I have no interest in seeing some, oh, hey, we got heads 4 times in a row. Must be a messed up coin. Not really. That happens sometimes, right? So those little studies with no mechanism that haven't been replicated, I can't really do anything with those results. But what I want to see is there's a mechanism in place, and we have enough different studies carried out by different people in different parts of the country and different parts of the world, we see that this is a thing that happens generally and is repeated many times. And, there are those weird instances where you're like, you know what, the supplement works, but only in one laboratory in the entire universe. That's not a very convincing story to me. I need to see that other people can use other methods and still show that this effect occurs because of this mechanism that we've seen before. So it comes down to, when am I convinced? Well, I need to have a mechanism. I need to have replication. I need to see that this actually works in different circumstances, in different settings with different people. And at the end of the day, it's got to work enough to matter, right? So like you'll see those big population-based studies where they're like, yeah, intake of this thing reduces blood pressure. Look how low our p-value is. And you say, wow, that's quite a lovely p-value, very impressive. But it like lowers systolic blood pressure by 1.5. But it was a cohort of 60,000 people, so I'm supposed to care about 1.5 on my systolic blood pressure. It's still 1.5. So like, even if you get to a point theoretically with a body of research where there's a mechanism that's defined, it seems to be a finding that's replicated time and time again. We have enough of those, repeated groups of coin flips that we're starting to really zero in on the true effect that we're observing. If that true effect that we're starting to zero in on is really, really, really small and virtually inconsequential, and it's going to cost me $60 a month to take the supplement, I'm still probably not going to take it, even though it checks some of those earlier boxes.
That's a really good answer. I think for a really good understanding of why you can have a huge sample size and why p-values almost ultimately always eventually become significant, if there's any true effect of any magnitude, imagine that coin was just very, very slightly weighted so that it would give heads slightly more. But you needed to do 1,000 flips to see, actually, it's 503 versus 497. You wouldn't give that to someone who is trying to run a gambling scheme. Be like, hey, man, this thing, it's going to give you heads a slightly more amount. You'd be like, no, I want the thing that's going to give me heads 4 out of 5 flips,
Right, yeah.
And that's exactly why with huge sample sizes, everything almost always becomes significant if there isn't any true difference. So that's just a kind of an extension of that really good analogy. And I think that's a really helpful way of looking at it. Now, Eric, the thing about this is that that's all nice and perfect and great if every single study that wasn't inherently methodologically flawed was exactly what it appeared to be at face value and was published, instead of maybe getting to the desk of the editor and then going, there's no novel findings here, no thanks. Or perhaps occasionally something a little more nefarious going on where that bias isn't just a systematic error that lab makes, but maybe they have a financial interest or, God forbid, actually just straight up makes some data up or manipulates it. So how does that play into it? I guess you could call that the human element, or the rewards of the journal publishing system and the academic publishing system. How does that influence this data? And is it the same in all fields, or is it maybe skew a little differently in the supplement industry funded research?
Yeah, so one of the things to keep in mind that kind of ties all of those sub-questions together is, there are some supplements that are supposed to work acutely, right? You give a dose, and when 60 minutes later you test exercise, they should perform better. And if you're going to do a really small study, I'm going to bring in 12 people. One day I give them the supplement, another day I give them the placebo. That's a study that can be done with a very small amount of money and a relatively small amount of time, depending on how you set it up. So with studies like that, you do have to be careful about the idea that if somebody runs the study and they just don't see anything particularly exciting, they might just not bother to actually write it up and publish it. And sometimes that's just like, it's not even a shady thing. Sometimes it's just like, this is just pretty not interesting. Like we thought maybe that we get some interesting findings, but this is kind of just a waste of everybody's time. So it's not always a nefarious thing. Like we have these secret null findings and we have to bury them and you never saw me here, right? Like it's not like that, but theoretically it could be, right? So if a company threw a bunch of money at you to do it and they're like, whoa, these findings are bad, you have to, you cannot publish it. But the good thing is most universities are pretty careful about that on the front end, about making sure that the contracts in place make sense. So like I believe, I'm not a professor at a university, but from kind of being in that world, it seems to me that most universities have some safeguards in place that when a professor initiates a contract with a supplement company, in many universities, it goes through the legal team and they like review it and make sure that the supplement company doesn't have an inappropriate amount of influence on what happens with the findings of the study, right? So there's some safeguards in place for stuff like that, but
that ostensibly prevents a supplement company from saying, "Hey, we get to call whether or not these findings get published," which would of course result in if we don't like the findings, they won't get published.
Well, my understanding is in these contracts, there's a lot of language related to who owns the data.
Right.
The people that funded it or the people that collected it, and who gets to choose what happens with that data. Who gets to decide whether or not someone intends to publish it. And if the researchers want to publish it, do they need prior approval or do they have to give it to the company ahead of time to at least let them get their marketing sorted out and say, oh crap, there's a bad study coming out in 30 days, So some of that stuff, my understanding is that it's in the contracts. The only supplement studies that I have written the grant for and gotten funded were funded by foundations, not the companies themselves. So I'm not like in there doing the contracts myself. So this is kind of my secondhand understanding that I think is pretty reflective of how it works. But anyway, like I was saying, with those little studies, you do have to be careful about the possibility that people are only electing to publish the ones that are pretty novel and exciting. And those generally will tend to show a decently sized effect, right? And so you can see this if I don't want to get too far into this because it's pretty technical, but if you've ever looked at a funnel plot in a meta-analysis and you see all the studies are on one side of the funnel plot, it gives you a reason to believe that there were a bunch of studies that happened on the bad side of that funnel plot with null findings, and people just opted not to publish them for whatever reason, or they tried and the journals weren't impressed by the unexciting findings of those studies. So you do have to think a little bit about some of those pressures, whether it relates to funding or the fact that journals seem to be fond of publishing statistically significant findings. And one of the things that can help you out with looking at that is as the studies get smaller in sample size, there's a not a perfect way of doing it, but in general, like a rule of thumb kind of. If the smaller studies tend to show bigger effects, that's usually not a great thing. What should happen is the bigger studies should be kind of in the middle in terms of the effect size that you see. And the smaller studies, you should be getting some really positive effects and some really unimpressive effects, and they should all kind of average out. So that's one of the concerns with those supplement studies that can be done quickly and inexpensively is the idea that you could do a small study and just say, it wasn't very exciting, let's not publish it. The nice thing about that is if it's a really long training study, like, so if it's not like, we give it to them and then that day we're going to see if it made them stronger in an hour. If it's like 12 weeks and we brought you into the lab 3 times a week for an hour of lifting, like those trials, those are going to get published. Nobody's just going to sit on those findings after putting in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of person hours. So it depends on the context of what the research question is and what those study designs look like. And finally, you did allude a little bit to the idea that, that theoretically somebody could just be making stuff up or fudging the numbers. And it's hard to have like a foolproof way of really identifying that, but it kind of gets back to what I was saying. If a supplement only works in one laboratory in the entire universe, and it's been tested several other places and it never works anywhere else, that's usually not a great. It could be a difference in the methods that lab is using. And so it doesn't necessarily mean anything nefarious is happening, but it does mean in order for this thing to work, the conditions have to be perfect. Mm-hmm. And you have to be measuring with the exact perfect methods. And you had to have been trained how to measure it from the same person. And so for the average person sitting at home thinking, should I take this supplement? Unless you train in their lab and your training looks exactly like the test that they seem to use, whether they're fudging it or not, it would indicate that whatever's happening in that lab doesn't generalize anywhere else. Again, right. Whether it's they're just using weird methods that no one else uses or whatever the case may be. So that's why I said it at the outset. I want to see this effect replicated in a bunch of different groups of people. And I want to see it happening in several different labs. And at that point, I feel pretty confident that we at least have something to work with there.
Totally makes sense. So Ben, kind of going to your phases of your career, where you started as being a nutrition expert, an RD, and starting at the same time as you being heavily involved in lifting, competing as a bodybuilder, competing as a power lifter. I imagine early in your career, before you went back to school, you were probably looking at supplements the way a science communicator like Eric Trexler would, a researcher would like Eric Trexler, or a well-informed consumer. Let me make sure there is a mechanism. I want to understand those acute studies. I may not fully understand the whole arc of that pathway of that mechanism, but primarily I want to see in the applied research, do we see robust findings with enough for me to be sufficiently convinced that it's worth me spending the money to formulate something with this in it? Is that an accurate kind of description of how you were at first?
Definitely. I mean, it definitely started by looking at what's published and what seems to be established. And then I'm going to go for bonus points and say, I think what changed, or what I realized quickly, is you can very easily get lost in everybody else doing sort of the same thing, because it's very hard to find novelty or stand out, separate yourself as a brand if you're just doing the creatine, beta alanine, citrulline. You know what I mean? It's just because
easy Ben.
Yeah, shots fired, bro. Yeah,
but if
there's no one here sitting that has a company that has those three ingredients, you know.
No, but you'd at least put caffeine in it as well.
Yeah, you didn't mention caffeine, so that's great.
Every company now, but then you see this industry-wide shift, because remember, we all saw before it was arginine, glutamine, some arginine salt, 9 different creatine forms. So once I think it's defined more by the research, and then the influential people in the field push more people or turn them on to that research, then I think the industry tends to adapt. But going back to my original point, I think the challenge in that is, I don't know. I think I'm more interested in finding that sort of gray area, because, again, with everything that Dr. Trexler went over, there's a lot of complexities of research. But if you were to wait for all of that to come out and then formulate, we'd have one product every 20 years. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And I wish we had the money to fund all of that. And that's also where it sort of contrasts with drug companies, is like, there's a reason that drug companies are awarded the patent and the patent period is 20 years, because really the first 15 is in the phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials and trying to validate it. And then it's even possible that at the end of that, they've sunk that money into a lost cause. But you really have around 5 years at the end of it to try to recoup all of that. So that's, I think, the other side of why I like the supplement side better as well, is like, if you're not that well funded, you can at least stay afloat and survive. And basically you're piggybacking on knowing that these aren't brand new things you're introducing into the human diet or human consumption. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So that all makes sense, and it also it helps me understand why you went towards delving into the pharmaceutical side of it. So now, if that's the way you used to look at it, and you felt kind of handcuffed by just trying to make a better version of what's already out there, or finding the pocket of studies that everyone else has missed, or this just doesn't seem marketable right now, because I do remember the time where I was just saying, like, hey, here's the 5 supplements we have like a collection of meta-analyses on. The rest are trash. Yep. Just buy those. And then it was not long after that a handful of supplement companies went out and went, you know what's crazy? We can be novel and cutting edge by making supplements that are actually based on stuff that works. And now you'll see, like you said, the industry has adapted. More often than not, if you get like a it's got a couple of, not just creatine, not just caffeine. It's got a couple of supplements that you could arguably say are quote unquote evidence-based. So the industry has adapted because of that. You've adapted. Now you're looking at things from the pharmaceutical side of it. Now in this arc of your career, how do you go about thinking about how do I want to formulate something?
So I'll start by saying I think the staples are the staples for a reason, and there's a good reason that every company, like you said, has adapted and started putting those in. Again, what I'm looking at is to try to do the staples, but some variation on top of it that is unique and stands apart and gives also a different subjective experience. So in doing that, I think before I realized the limitation was if I only know what's published and I'm only reading what's been told or what's clear or what's on Examine or what's on whatever these databases are, it's going to be very hard to differentiate. But if I can understand, okay, this works on this pathway, well, now I can find the similarity between that class of compound, and there will be a multitude more that act on that pathway. So now I can specifically search down a pathway and find numerous different compounds of different potencies on that pathway that may or may not have been published yet. Because I think the interesting thing is, like, you can go outside for a walk and just in a few of those trees, there's hundreds or thousands of different compounds that maybe we either haven't discovered yet, or they're published in some kind of like journal of natural products or something, where it's still a leap to take it from there to supplements. But I've been pretty humbled in finding interesting things that have turned into either something or an interesting concept, something even as simple as like menthol, where, okay, like people know they put it in, muscle ache rub and stuff like that, but there might be mechanisms for ingestion of it. And there actually are some published things. Again, they're small, very small sample sizes, but I'm not ready to totally cut them out just because there might be something there. And I think right now the something there is sort of in the both self-experimentation and the small piloting with small groups, because, and maybe you guys can totally pick this one apart, but I think the example that I would propose to that is we didn't start taking caffeine because it was published in the Journal of Cro-Magnon Man. You know what I mean? Like there was still a lot of
great journal, by the way.
Yeah. There was still a lot of self-experimentation with plants and foods and all of those things. And I do understand the scope and power of pharmaceutical industries, but I don't think they've discovered everything that's interesting. And I also don't think that we should just step back and say, okay, they got it covered. They have these massive R&D facilities. They've figured every single thing out. That's with the compound part. And then the other end of it is with the delivery and with altering things like solubilities and stuff. Like, perfect example here is, okay, so creatine monohydrate, we know it's effective. We know it's the best form, but it does not have the best water solubility. That is a problem when you're mixing it in a multi-ingredient formulation. People don't like the grittiness. There's some aspects to that. Okay, well, when you make a salt, you make a compound more polar. Water's polar, so like mixes with like. So creatine hydrochloride undeniably has an exponentially better water solubility. So you can take that for almost every single possible form of compound, and you have you have the chance to actually improve the profile of that compound where it wasn't effective in that form, but you make a salt and now it's better. And that's true of, I could name like 10, 20 compounds that's either happened with or sort of in development of. So I think there's the mechanism aspect, and then there's also the form that you can play with that totally opened up to me through this degree that I didn't have when looking at it just as the nutrition person, kind of looking at it from, I think, the broader level.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we went 5 minutes ago in this conversation, we were essentially looking at a closed loop, right? Researchers research supplements that are out. They either work or they don't.
Yep.
Supplement person looks at the research to see what works, formulates supplements based on that. That's great. Everything will be #science and evidence-based. But 10 years from now, we just have the same shit. And obviously, there was a point before we had the research or the compounds. So I think what we're seeing from you, Ben, is that there does need to be experimentation. People need to be thinking about another thing to consider. You talked about pathways. We haven't fully mapped every single physiological process in the body, nor are we on track to be doing that anytime in the near future. So as we discover new nuances of the body and physiology, and as we think about, okay, well, what could enact an effect on that? And then also the side little tree branch of what other forms could I manipulate that specific compound in to make it more effective. I think now we kind of see, this is an ecology that is growing over time. So I guess
there's some irony to that. Just real quick interjection is like, we've defined these classes of receptors, and this goes back to something I referred to before, based upon the natural compound that we found acted upon them. There's a reason that we call them nicotinic cholinergic receptors, muscarine, nicotine. There's a reason that why we call them opioid receptors, because they responded to opium. So like, I think that just sort of exemplifies exactly what you're saying. I just totally believe that there's still so much more to explore.
That's actually a really interesting critique of some of the quantitative method. The adage that I think is really useful, although it's not actually true. It's only useful in the methodological framework of quantitative methodology, right? Is that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And we get pretty fuzzy when it comes to measuring the subjective human experience. But exactly what you're saying is like, nicotine does something. People are definitely feeling things when nicotine is smoked or ingested or put on their arm. We don't know what's going on. And now we have to track that subjective experience and just assume, even though there's nothing to be measured yet, something's happening. What are we finding? So Trexler, this kind of goes back to what you were saying, where like, look, you're not interested. If there's no mechanism, why am I going to even consider this? But there are times when there is no established mechanism, but multiple applied studies from different places seem to find something going on. And I remember we found ourselves in this rabbit hole during one of our peer review discussions on oral ATP supplementation. And I just remember finding myself at some point feeling horribly inadequate as I'd gone down to the extent and the limits of my physiology knowledge, and then beyond it. And every time I would make an assumption about, that must be going on, there'd be some other factor that was making that probably not it. And we eventually got to a point where we just threw our hands up and went like, something's happening. We don't know what it is. So there are still things yet to be discovered. So you don't always necessarily need a mechanism, do you, to make a statement about a supplement?
I would say, so you're clearly straw manning me and putting words in my mouth, which you like to do.
Absolutely.
So if memory serves, the question was framed of, before I put my name on it and tell the consumer, this is a rock solid done deal, buy as many tubs as you can today because they might run out soon. For me to go there, I want some better explanation of what's happening. Sure. Because this idea, if we literally have no idea what's happening with this compound in the human body, I would also, like, then we have to talk about, well, are we certain it's safe long term? Like what exactly is this mysterious compound doing at all levels, not just making us bench press more? But no, so I think it
like squat more as well.
If you insist, but
sure, okay, yeah.
Omar, it's all about the benching. But I mean, it comes down to a couple of things, which are important clarifications. So for me, it's if the hurdle I'm getting over is, does an ingredient have my interest? Do I believe there's potential or promise there? Then yeah, those applied studies or those subjective experiences that we haven't fully yet described or elucidated, of course, I'm not going to start out with the position it's worthless until I have a meta-analysis. If you take that approach, a lot like Ben was alluding to earlier, you're never going to get anywhere in terms of innovation or progress when it comes to these different compounds. So I certainly don't take that approach. I'd like to maintain an open mind and say, interesting, one small study, we're seeing some more repetitions getting completed. But let's not throw it out and say that's worthless. It doesn't count. But let's be a little bit cautious until we understand, does that generalize and is it reproducible in other studies? And then hopefully we'll start to get a better idea of what exactly it might be doing. So it's not about discounting it entirely until we understand everything about it. But there is different levels of, this is promising. I'm very intrigued by it. And there might be something there that's very different from, rush out and buy it. And another thing we talked about was, formulators getting their ideas from what they're seeing published in the research. And so I don't look at the body of research as being the forward leaning side of the equation where it's like, well, the research has all the answers and the formulators are just saying, did you hear about the new research that came in? We have a new thing. That is, in my opinion, the complete opposite of what happens, at least within this area. In my perspective of what's happening is that smart creative people like Ben are saying, you know what? These people are saying that they feel more alert when they ingest this herb. I wonder what's in that herb. I wonder if there's something there that might be, in this example, an effective stimulant. It's the formulators and the influential members of the industry that are pushing the innovation. I would say that the research understanding is on a very significant time lag. We are in a major delay. So after Ben comes up with this remarkably creative idea and it pans out and they formulate it and they've got this thing, then the research labs, like the types of labs that I would have worked in the past, then they say, oh, you've got a thing there. We'll test it for you and see what happens. And then 15 years after that starts, we're ready for a meta-analysis because we finally have enough studies to warrant one. So I think the important thing is really framing it in the opposite direction, which is that the research perspective, theoretically, in terms of the way we view the null hypothesis, the research in this context is not designed for innovation. The starting assumption is, whatever Ben just slid across the desk for me to test is worthless until I'm proven otherwise. And I don't get to prove that wrong until we've done 15 studies on it, and it's been 25 years since Ben created it. So it's really important to frame those as to getting an understanding of the time courses, but also the directionality is really critical.
You took that straw man and did exactly what I wanted you to do, Eric, and kind of highlight how sometimes if we take that very, very rigid unidirectional look at the way research should work, quote unquote, right, that it can leave you nowhere, or it can leave you behind, or that it is not the same thing as innovation, or maybe perhaps the way publication or the quote unquote evidence-based work is done in the world of chemistry or pharmacology. So I think that's really helpful. And one cool thing I also want to point out that speaks to what you said is how there are levels of mechanisms. One thing you might see in a study is, we think this improved performance via blood flow. Blood flow, that is a mechanism. But I mean, there's a lot of things that affect blood flow. That's not the same thing as establishing via what pathway that actually occurred. And I think you'll see that all the time. I'll see a study where they'll discuss how it had some impact on a hormone. and they'll leave it at that. Or they'll say, hey, it had this physiological outcome, which is associated with performance. It improved buffering. But actually how it improved buffering, what is actually going on, or something like that, that's a whole nother level. And so I do think it is not just black and white mechanism or applied.
And if I could kind of add an example onto that. So like you were saying, my initial response was, well, I need a mechanism or else I'm not interested, right? Well, that's in terms of us being like, okay, we found the next creatine, right? If you're going to tell me it's the next creatine, we better know what it's doing, right?
Yeah.
But, mechanism, like you said, there's levels. So if we have this new novel ingredient and there's been a few studies and people are doing more reps to failure and their RPE levels are consistently dramatically lower, we're saying this exercise feels way easier for them. Is that a mechanism? In a way, but eventually we're going to start talking about receptors and hormones and ligands and binding and all that other stuff. That's the real nitty-gritty mechanism. So we've got enough there to say, oh, this is reducing perceived effort and that's helping people perform better. For me, in many cases, that's enough for me to work with, where I can at least have some understanding of what's happening. But if you tell me this supplement, there's one study on it, there were 8 people per group, they did more reps, but every other thing we measured was identical, I don't have much to work with there.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a really much more nuanced understanding for everyone. Omar, I do want to kick it over to you to get some of your thoughts on, we've talked about a lot and you've been silent, which A, is weird, but B, I think because you're in the position of, you're not a researcher, you're also not a formulator, but you are someone involved in the game, you are one of the many Heisenbergs around, but you're actually not Heisenberg because that would be a formulator. Yeah. I don't really know what you do, but you have to know enough of... Yeah, that's okay. That's all right. You have to know enough about all of this to be successful, I would argue. So let me understand your thoughts from your position on all these topics.
If only there was a way potentially in the future to work with a formulator in some capacity. Wow, that'd be truly stupendous. Is that a hint at something, or is that just who knows? What I would say is that first, I think we've spoken about it before, the concept of being a late adopter. So it all depends upon, of course, in the space what you hope to do. And Ben does a fantastic job as a formulator, bringing that novelty or being cutting edge, right? So that is kind of one of the fundamental precepts of his company. And so entering it, I actually come kind of as the late adopter, as we discussed in a previous video on YouTube, or the idea of being a little skeptical, right? Like, let me see what this does. I'll wait that time out. And so before making a recommendation, and maybe some of that comes from YouTube, like, your reputation's on the line. You don't want to say, do A and B will happen, and then B doesn't happen. And people are like, well, but you said, but you told me. And so you have these kids with tears in their eyes. So you always want to be, and also without the proper context, when you're also trying to instruct a lot of individuals at once, so a large group of people, you're basically battling against the supplement industry, let's just call it that, where they make a lot of erroneous, outlandish claims. So you kind of want to balance that, right? And so my job, as Sean would say, like being a strength journalist, is trying to wade through some of that stuff, trying to find those best practices, trying to whittle it down in a way that it's distilled enough where it still has the fidelity and there's some nuance, but then there's also the applicability, I guess the word I would use. And so that obviously was the cornerstone behind what we started with Gnosis that then became Ouroboros. Is like, what works, what is proven effective, how can then we differentiate it, not from the ingredients, but then from the signaling. So from the marketing perspective, like how we do it. And so branding became very important, where it's like a no frills, kind of fully transparent. We list what's in it, like here's the process, A, B, C, D, and then a few other things. But one thing I will say is that's why I think you always have to go back to individuals that know what they're talking about, and that's why I joked at the beginning about Eric Trexler. But of course, when it came time to formulate something more complicated than the things that work, like the pre-workout, and I wanted to do a multivitamin, it's like you actually want someone that has a PhD or at least is well educated in this topic, and that's why Dr. Peter Fishin was the one that did the multivitamin. It's kind of weird to me, and we joke about, Eric, the critiques of capitalism, that it's like, okay, it's actually not that expensive to ask someone that knows what they're talking about, that's qualified, in order to do some of the work, right? And in order to tell you, like, you know what, I've sifted through this stuff. Here's what works. Here's a recommendation. But strangely enough, and I'm not going to cast any shade at any particular company, but for all the work that Ben does, you would think, like, so the way Ben frames it is true. It's like Ben's at the forefront. You know what I'm saying? Like, he's, when it comes to formulation or the thought process. But actually, it's kind of a lot of people imitating one another. And even worse than that, most supplement companies, if you were to, just analyze, let's say, the pre-workout or whatever, it's like they're not even getting the basics right. So it's like, they're majoring in the minors and they have no idea what they're doing. And they're kind of hearing maybe what Trexler said, where it's like, you take a little piece here. I heard this one research review. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. And that's why actually after this, Eric, I want to open it up to the concept. I think illustrating an Icarus supplement, I want to call, like HMB, kind of what everything that we've been talking about here would probably be pretty cool. But I was going to say, most people, Eric, straight up don't even get the basics right. So it's a very interesting space to be, where you have people that want to be novel, so they want to be doing something new, but they don't have the understanding that, what's this mechanism or what's going on. So by simply not messing up, to be honest, like by not making these major mistakes, or major, even honestly, branding mistakes where you're making outlandish claims. Like I saw, again, being very generic here, but some of those pitfalls was like, what are you putting on your label here that this does ABC? I'm like, you can't, that's an outlandish claim. You can't make that claim. It's like, by essentially not making those pitfalls and not being scuzzy, it's like, yeah, you kind of could do all right.
Yeah, it's crazy that you just have to know how to use like an open access journal's position stance. Yeah. And know how to use the search bar and examine, and then just not suck with marketing. And if a big business wanted to all of a sudden do all the evidence-based stuff and have better supplements, it's actually pretty low-hanging fruit. Yeah. You need someone who can successfully search databases and maybe think of second-order effects when you start combining two different things together. Yeah. But yeah, like I think you brought up that is different than innovation, but it is a pretty low barrier to entry if you just want to do a not bad job of having things that work.
You know what is really eye-opening? Just in listening to that, I think it makes me realize like how biased you tend to become once you do something enough. Because I think, let's use bodybuilding as the example, is if you bring someone off the street who has no concept of bodybuilding and you bring them into a show, they see the same muscle groups on people and they can't differentiate the difference. And like Omar, as I was listening to you, I realized like I think the average consumer doesn't really think there's that big of a difference between supplements. They're just sort of brand signaling or, kind of doing brand loyalty. But the reality is there's a massive difference, and it does come into those nitty-gritty details. And it's not necessarily dangerous stuff. I think that's certainly one side of the industry, but I also think it's like there's this drive to want to put more and more in because more is better, and then I could market more because there's more ingredients. But the one concept that I see overlooked so often is putting in competing ingredients where they're actually using the same transport mechanism, like things that are conflicting. And it's like they've spent 10, 20% more to make that product when they could have actually got rid of it, gave people more of the effect they were looking for, but they'd have to step back the marketing a little bit. And they choose to go the marketing route. And it's crazy because sometimes it's like you're uneducating people on marketing to try to educate them.
Mm-hmm. And you only have a finite amount of time to try and talk with the consumer. It's like, so what are you going to do, Ben? It's like, I'm spending 80% of the time re-educating them. And for all we've talked about, man, what's crazy, let's call it just very loosely here, evidence-based supplements. What does that mean? Not making any outlandish claims, trying to adhere to, the current available research, and then communicate it in such a way that it's transparent, cool, if that's our working definition. There's probably only a handful of companies, like Ben, there's your company, there's Ouroboros, there's Citadel, shout out to Citadel, and then like Legion Athletics. Like for all this talk of all these things, it's like, how many supplement companies are there? Hundreds, thousands, potentially. It's like, how many are kind of doing some of these in various aspects? A handful. It's crazy. Yeah. No,
I think it might be worth, given that you just kind of opened up the awareness that, hey, marketing might be the default choice when they think about the bottom line. It does speak to just how effective can a supplement be? If the subjective experience, if even an effective supplement doesn't beat out how much placebo effect or expectancy you might get from a good marketing campaign, you know? So it is kind of one of those things, you know, Omar, you mentioned majoring in the minors, but to some degree, the supplement game as a whole is majoring in the minors, you know, because even if we're talking about the subjective experience of jumping on creatine or taking caffeine, I think that is probably why it's just not going to have that much of an effect in the broad scheme of things, especially in someone who's training hard and doing other things right. And I think, Ben, you talked about this, how the current craze of emphasizing nootropics or pre's or stimulants or things that change your subjective experience, or perhaps why something like a beta-alanine seems to be catching on more than citrulline malate, even though they both kind of have like leaning positive results, is you get the tingles from beta. Something's happening, you know? So talk to me about that. How is the subjective experience in the consumer driven the industry lately? And that's driven your interest as well as a formulator.
I think you're always going to find the thing that locks a company into being either established or unforgettable from the competition is to have a product that works. Again, there's a reason that, you know, like EAS pretty much built their brand upon creatine. So that's always a component. There's no way that I think anybody who's honest and formulates could dance around the idea that you have to have subjective effects, and the buy-in is going to be so much lower on something like a vitamin D, where you don't feel, it's more of a chronic thing. So that's always a huge component. But I guess it depends on how you look at it. Like, I look at that as almost a challenge. Is okay, there's, you know, these ingredients that I know will work in time that someone will get the subjective effect from. But if I can balance that with something that's immediately apparent, and I can validate either in human or in something that's going to go towards a better way, because obviously we could just pixie dust some cocaine in there, and that's total joke, and make somebody feel something. But like, it's basically trying to balance both sides of it, where you're hitting on the subjective. It's something that, you know, somebody wants to get back, and the hardest thing is something tangible like muscle growth. So I think, sort of, to use the analogy you did, the lowest hanging fruit right now tends to be the stimulant area and nootropics, because they're acute. You feel it quick within 15, 20 minutes. And typically it does something that I think most people are looking for, or they're used to, because of what pharmaceuticals are doing. Like, the amount of people prescribed Adderall now to study. Well, it's probably not why they're prescribed it, but that's their primary use of it. And I think it's weird. People tend to defer. Pharmaceuticals are FDA regulated, supplements aren't, but there's a lot more overlap between the two categories than I think most people would realize or would acknowledge. Right.
You kind of described almost like the off-label use of things, which I think speaks to the power of the subjective experience. It's really what drives people. Yeah. I think another really strong reason why people, especially in the evidence-based community, and I want to know all your thoughts on this, the driving factor of why they might get a certain supplement is sometimes FOMO, like fear of missing out, right? Like, if I know, and I wrestle with this sometimes, like in my book, you know, I put in the supplement chapter, like, here's the stuff we got the evidence that actually works. I know that a lot of the people who are buying those supplements now, they're buying it because those things just became hashtag evidence-based, because Ben Esgro, Eric Trexler, Eric Helms, Omar Isuf said they are. I don't feel any effect. I don't notice any difference. It's kind of like 6 vitamin Ds. You know, I'm doing these because if I don't, I'm missing out on something that's possibly beneficial. Do you think that is a large motivating factor in the current kind of immersion of these companies that are trying to be evidence-based, whatever that means?
I think absolutely yes, because if you look at the wording and the way marketing has been in fitness since the beginning, it's almost like you might be missing out on that extra pound of muscle that you could have gained if you used, like, that still happens. that type of hyperbole and wording. So yeah, unfortunately, it is part of it, and obviously, it's clearly effective. So it's very tough to compete with that, but yeah, it exists, and I don't think it's unfortunately going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I don't even know that we can necessarily blame that on marketing, because I think marketing does follow human behavior and emotion.
Sure.
And it happens to me inadvertently. Like I was just recently in the comments section. I was on a different podcast, and they asked me about some of the research that we'd reviewed in mass on sleep. And I was talking about things you can do besides just simply saying, hey, sleep more. Because I think a lot of people struggle with that. And someone responded in the comments, they're like, hey, I feel great sleeping about 6 hours per day. I'm doing just fine. What should I do to improve my sleep? And I said, so just to clarify, you're progressing in the gym, you're happy, you don't feel tired, and your life's good. And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, if it ain't broke, you
Right.
know? But
Helms, you're man, that applies so much to training. Like there's so many people out there that are on a very effective training program, making gains, putting on muscle, benches going up, and they're like, but what if I was getting results 5% more quickly? And they implode the whole thing, go to a completely different paradigm. That just, yeah, you struck a nerve with me there. You know, when people are like, yeah, but how can I totally restructure everything I do? And it's like, but you just told me everything's going very, very smoothly.
But is it
yeah,
optimal?
that's almost like, yeah, that's it's like the grass is greener version of FOMO. You know, it's not
Yeah,
necessarily
yeah.
even fear driven. That impatience driven, or that I could be doing better. And that is kind of the two sides of that same coin. I think there's a lot of fear driven ones, but there's also that optimal driven one. The fear driven one I can think of is, how do I know if I'm allergic to this food? I'm like, you would experience an allergic reaction. You don't need to we see it all the time. Like the gut irritant, or the thing that's killing your health, or the thing that's ruining your life, and you don't know it. This insidious secret, you need to fix it.
Yeah.
I think that really grinds my gears. It makes me mad when I see it, because I know it's purposeful. I know it's playing on people's fears. But the optimal one, I understand that, because I was that guy. I'm still that guy sometimes, where things are going okay, but I'm sure it could be better, right? I just saw someone on Instagram who's stronger than me. Why am I not them? It's probably something I'm not taking or not doing in the gym. So 100%.
Eric, I want to put you in the spot, my man, to contribute with everyone else, because you've been doing a fantastic job being the interviewer here. But I do think it would be illustrative to sit you three down and walk the average person listening to this through the process of maybe a new emerging supplement, kind of the research window, and then why it ultimately gets discarded. And so I brought up, if this was 2011, I'd say, guys, I got a great thing I want to talk about: branch chain amino acids. It's going to change the world. But alas, this is a decade later. So HMB, I think, is the one, for me at least, that comes to mind. And I think the key word we've been using in this discussion, Trexler said it, nefarious. I don't think anyone's nefarious in their intention of either thinking that this was a potential a beneficial supplement. I think there were many people that, once again, kind of that maybe the novelty. Again, back to the critiques of capitalism, you want to have something new on the market. So you get excited when you're like, oh, wait, 28% improvement? No, more than a steroid? You got to be kidding me, right? And it has a cool abbreviation. Like, I'm just telling you now, as a consumer, you start hearing it. It's not like, whatever. This supplement that sounds kind of generic. Oh, glutamine. Yeah. It's, HMB. What does HMB stand for? So maybe for the three of you, I would have Trexler kick it off, and then I want to hear Helms and then Ben. Ben is a formulator, kind of like your thought process where you heard about HMB. Maybe T-Rex, if you could just set us up for everyone, what HMB is, why it was a buzzword, and how that basically, let's call it, maybe I could be wrong with the years here, like the 5-6 year process of like, ooh, new hot thing, kind of seems good. Everyone starts, they want to be early adopters. I noticed some supplement companies, boom, threw it in immediately. And then body of evidence, you're like, no. So it's kind of that Icarus trajectory. So set us up for us, my man.
Yes, I would be happy to do that. I will be honest. HMB was one of those things I never even got that into, but I think I have a pretty good understanding of how it went down. So HMB, Ben was talking previously about how he would focus in on a pathway and then kind of go from there. How can we maybe target this pathway? And so I think HMB was very appealing in that sense because HMB is a leucine metabolite. And so the whole process there is like, seems like protein's pretty good, right? And then we're like, yeah, but it seems like high quality or complete proteins are pretty good. And then we focus in on branched chain amino acids, and then we focus in on leucine. And we notice, okay, leucine is a very special amino acid. And then we break off into these different metabolites of leucine. And HMB is not the only one. There's HICA and KIC, I think.
Yep.
Yeah.
KIC, yeah.
But HMB was the one that kind of made a big splash on the scene. And HMB had been out there before it made this reemergence. There had been a bunch of HMB research prior to that, but one of the things that I think got a lot of excitement going was it was a slightly different form of HMB. And so it had that novelty factor, kind of like how Ben was saying, well, like, don't sleep on a supplement. Maybe we go a salt version and we get a very different characteristic from the supplement. So it checked all those boxes, going back to some of those discussions. The mechanism kind of made sense because it is kind of part of that whole leucine kind of family of metabolites. And the idea was this would help with muscle recovery or muscle growth and, ultimately result in strength gains and stuff like that. There was a study that came out with some big results that got a lot of attention. And that's kind of how the ball got rolling. But, as we kind of talked about earlier, I think I'm kind of, my default position is when we see one big study that comes out, say, oh, cool, let's see if it gets replicated. Because I'm not in Ben's shoes. I don't need to formulate a supplement and say, I am on the cutting edge, and there's some whispers that this thing's going to be the next big thing. So for me, I have the luxury of sitting back and saying, okay, well, let's replicate it 4 or 5 times over the next 3 years in at least 3 or 4 different labs. So it kind of highlights that difference in perspective. But yeah, that's kind of the background, is that HMB, there was this new form. There was a single study that came out with some really big results. And I think maybe a couple others that followed, at least 1 or 2 others that followed with some big results. And it got a lot of excitement going. And then those results didn't seem to replicate very well. There were people who said, I don't think that those first results, they don't really seem to make sense to us. There were some pretty high profile letters to the editor. And then, it kind of, a lot of the enthusiasm died down, and that's where I will hand off the baton.
Yeah. Eric, you're a communicator, my friend.
Yeah, I take the baton from Eric, and then exactly like you don't do in a race, I run the other direction, because I'm going to start even earlier. When I first got exposed to HMB, I want to say in 2004, when I first started lifting, we brought up EAS. EAS was the closest thing probably to an evidence-based supplement company. We're talking the late 90s, early 2000s. And they had this booklet that used research, published research, and said, hey, here is our top tier supplements that we actually think have an effect. Here's what you're interested in. And I shit you not, in the same tier as creatine, whey protein, and caffeine, HMB. And back then, I didn't know anything. It's 2004. I'd literally just started lifting. I was still in the Air Force. I had nothing besides. I'm just one of those guys who thinks the grass is always greener. And if you can tell me there's a whiff of a hint that a supplement can be beneficial, hey, thank you, Uncle Sam, for my first and 15th check from the Air Force. That's going right into the trash, actually, but but into my mouth as well. So anyway, and I remember HMB being in there. Now only 16 years later, looking back, do I see that might have been a little of an aggressive stance, but they weren't that far off based on what was actually published at that time. Right around either 2000, is early 2000s or mid 2000s, there was a meta-analysis published with positive findings for strength and hypertrophy with HMB. The caveat, though, and this is back before HMB free acid, which is the resurgence that Eric Trexler talked about. That's Lord of the Rings. We're going to the Hobbit back when it was HMB calcium, okay? And the original form of HMB, almost all of the research was on untrained individuals. And it's had these pretty robust, consistent findings. And that's still the case. If you were today, right now, do a study with any form of HMB, and you had a pretty robust training protocol with a large enough sample size, I would bet on an untrained group beating placebo. And that's because one of the primary high-level mechanisms that we talked about before is that it seems to mitigate the muscle damage response. And we know that untrained individuals get a lot of that. Try to think of how sore you got the very first time you trained. So yeah, it's actually at the point where the amount of muscle damage you're getting when you're very first exposed to a stimulus like that is probably actually getting in the way of you making progress. And if you're looking at just the first 8 weeks of your whole training experience, that could be, a quarter of that training time. And if you tell me that you're making that stimulus less counterproductive for a quarter of that training time, yeah, you're going to see a robust effect. However, once they started doing analyses on trained individuals with HMB, these findings started to really go away and get more and more nuanced. And there's then repeated meta-analyses on trained individuals in the 5 years after that basically killed it. And that was where we were around the mid 2000s, 2010-ish or so, where then there was what I believe, having been a part of some of these higher profile letters to the editors, a purposeful manipulation of data, unfortunately, which is very rare. And at the very least, even if we don't go with that narrative, which is my personal belief, and I'm happy to state that, even if we just go with, hey, this looks funky, statistical analyses, findings, and lack of replication alone would lead someone to be very wary of those specific studies that Dr. Trexler was talking about. But nonetheless, more importantly, when you look at the trained studies on individuals using this new free acid form of HMB, I'm not aware of any findings that didn't come out of that lab that had an impact on hypertrophy or strength that weren't studies that looked at, say, for example, high volume depth jumps and just looking at the muscle damage response and recovery. So if you really stack the deck to try to leverage what HMB probably does, if you create a novel damage response in a trained individual, yeah, that might improve their performance if that's the limiting factor. But I think it's kind of I'm really glad you asked about HMB specifically, Omar, because it's the convergence of a lot of these things. There is a mechanism, but there is a specific scenario where it may only work and has to be done that way or in that specific population. And then also there might have been some influence from the supplement industry, which, while rare, it can indeed happen. So I think, I don't know if there's more of this race to run. Hopefully it didn't take too much, but Esgro, here you go.
I think you guys did a much better job of the review of the literature than I ever could hope to. So I don't have much to add on that front. I think the only thing that I would just say, I guess just my personal experience with it, because before the free acid ever came out, I of course I experimented and I wanted to see, like you said, Eric, is there something here to this? Because I hear about it a lot and it seems to be being pushed by people that I trust way back. And I never, no matter what, if I followed the highest dosing regimens from whatever was published, I would never see anything notable. Nobody I knew who was using it would ever really remark much other than something that was, maybe it's doing this, maybe it's doing that. And I kind of reversed on it and looked at it and like, okay, so it's roughly 5% of the degradation of leucine goes to HMB. If it was that important or that impactful, why would it be so physiologically insignificant that only that percentage would get shunted off? I think kick might even be converted higher than from leucine than HMB is. And then I was just immediately skeptical about the free acid, just largely because I think there's innovation to market something, and then there's innovation to improve on an inherent flaw. And the issue is there was no problems with absorption of the calcium salt. There was no need to convert it to its free acid form. You actually make more hurdles in because it's more acidic. So you have to, enterically coat it, and I think they were gel capped. So it requires even more technology and more investment of money. So I was immediately skeptical, and I just, and then once I saw everything, and then I was also part of those letters to the editor, and so I never quite bought in, but it was certainly an interesting thing to follow.
Resisting that new sexy, man, that's a big deal right there, especially because I do think probably Ben, I don't know if you'd agree with this, man, but as someone in the supplement space where you're trying to bring new things in quotation to the market, or a new form or iteration, or the way that you do it, there is kind of that pressure where you're trying to look for things but then also not make mistakes, because you value obviously your consumers, the customers that are purchasing your stuff, where you're not going to say, well, I think, theoretically this seems like it checks out, and then it turns out to be bunk. And I think maybe that's probably what I see, or maybe that was partially my reaction, or the idea behind Ouroboros, is that, like, if everyone's getting so hyped up around their supplements and people are basically becoming jaded, it's like just stating things as they are in the doses that seem effective. It's like, and that's it. Here we go.
Yeah, I think it goes back to I think what both Erics talked about, and just there being actually an opportunity. And yes, there is this sort of challenge to overcome, but I think there is an opportunity by not going the traditional marketing route. Is, yeah, you might not get as many ears, but the people that you can convert, once they actually see or hear that you've led them to a better path, it's like now they can become educators of more people. It's like a nice trickle down. So yeah, I think you could look at it two ways. You either look at it as the opportunity, or you look at it as, I'm not even going to try because it's so saturated that marketing is the only way to go, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think opening up, maybe Eric, to bring it full circle, because I know Trexler wrote about this, the idea or the validity of, let's say, third-party testing, or being wary of the supplements you choose, or just in essentially, I think Brad Schoenfeld, I'm not sure if he's the one that first said this when it comes to the training industry, that essentially in an unregulated industry, it kind of is up to the participants to try and do their best to either inform individuals or reduce that asymmetry, where it's like, well, wait a minute here, like that's an outlandish claim, I don't know about that, to basically get past the marketing bull. So I would ask Trexler then the role of some of this third-party testing, or some of the things that can be done seemingly now that, anyone can publish, not anyone can publish, sorry, I shouldn't say that, but anyone can produce any supplement as long as it's nothing new. You can make pretty much any claim that you want. It's like, so then what is the role then of some of this third-party testing to get like kind of a stamp of approval for, like, yes, this has what it claims it has, or what is its function or utility for the average person that's just thinking up until this point in time, man, I'm on Amazon T-Rex and this one's the cheapest, I gotta go with that one. Like, I gotta save my money. They're all the same. They're all creatine. Like, of course, why am I going to finagle over price? I'm going for the cheapest one. So what's kind of the function here, man?
Yeah, so the third-party testing does have some nice upsides. It's like we talked about previously, there is this kind of post-market regulatory system in place. So what that means is, it's not like you create a supplement, you send it to a laboratory that does really, in-depth analytical testing and verifies your label claims and make sure there's no adulterants and make sure that there's no contamination involved. And then they say, okay, you can put it on the market. That's not how the process works. And so the nice thing about these third-party certification programs is that a company can opt in, and at their own expense, by the way, can opt in and say, we would like to subject ourselves to some level of third-party testing. And that can take several different forms. It can just be, yeah, we're going to make sure that your facility is technically a legal facility, that you're actually doing the bare minimum and not violating federal laws. Like that, there are third-party certifications that are that low, and they still get their own little sticker on the label. But some of the third-party stuff goes to a much higher level, and they say, well, we're going to randomly test batches, throughout the year, and we're going to make sure there's no contaminants. We're going to test it against the WADA list or whatever list we choose. And so there's varying levels, but the nice thing about it is that it gives the consumer a little bit of confidence that there's not any corners being cut. And, we've talked throughout this interview about different instances of people who paid good money for protein and got a lot less protein than they thought. because the company was amino spiking or nitrogen spiking. Instances where people thought they were buying a very safe, benign stimulant product, and they were actually getting ingredients with much different safety profiles with potential for harm. And so as a consumer, it's a nice thing that a company can opt into. But like I said, it is at the company's own expense. And so there are some small companies where it's like, if you know the people that run it, if you have that privilege and you're like, I know that so-and-so is not, dumping a bunch of drugs into my pre-workout, but I know that they're a small company and it fiscally would be very difficult for them to opt into third-party testing. Like, I don't immediately say, like, no matter who's selling it, it's got to be third-party tested or they're trying to kill you. Like, that's not the case. But for a consumer who doesn't know who's actually making their product and doesn't have that ability to say, no, I know Ben's a good guy, I trust that he's, making good products, it is a nice thing consumers can do where they can say, okay, this company, the way I always frame it to people is, these big nutrition companies, it's something they can do to take the first step toward earning your trust if they haven't otherwise done it. So someone like Omar or Ben, like, if I already know them and trust that they're making good products, I might not be a stickler about it and say, nope, it's got to be third party. But if it's just some random company and I don't know who's involved, it's them taking the first step and saying, I will eat this cost to give you the peace of mind of knowing that that this stuff is up to the label claims and doesn't have any adulterants in it.
Fantastic. Eric, before I go to Ben.
No, I actually want to hear what Ben has to say, because I know he's the one who has to make those decisions. And I know as someone who's competed in both drug-tested bodybuilding and powerlifting, you can understand that even more so than the average consumer who just wants to make sure they're not going to die and that the supplement actually does help them. Yeah. We have seen, I'm going to put this straight up. People have definitely said, oh, it was in my supplement, that's why I failed the test, and have lied. That probably happens more often than the actual occurrence of someone having something in their supplements where it was a contaminant. But that absolutely does happen. I know people personally who that has happened to. So, I mean, honestly, myself, I'm still a ridiculous psychotic meathead competitor who's trying to be as big and as strong as possible. And I do really think about where and when I'm going to get supplements. And because, I mean, can you imagine? I'm not just the guy who will get banned by the WNBF. It would be an absolute shit show on social media if Eric Helms failed the drug test. I'm like, I swear to God, it was just something in my pre. I think it would probably ruin my life. So I think there are a lot of people out there.
If I could, I know a lot of people when they hear the supplement thing, they roll their eyes, but there are you can find the news articles and the website articles of people who have said, no, it was this supplement. You can test my product. I still have some left over. They match up the analyte to what was in the urine. The amounts make sense. I mean, there are open and shut cases where it has happened for sure.
Absolutely. Yep. Appreciate that backup. So anyway, you're aware of that. You've probably thought about it yourself when you were competing. And now you're someone who is behind the helm of, as we saw in our last episode when you were on, very difficult financial decision to start and keep a supplement company afloat. What does that calculus look like, and how do you make a decision?
So I'm going to attempt to tie in both of things that you guys said throughout. I'll start by saying I do think it is a great opportunity for the company to prove themselves, because as we started the call, I said that it is on the company. The FDA is not intervening unless there's an adverse event. So I do think that they need to have something that they can stand up to. So I think the second layer of it is that while I appreciate that if people know me and they trust me as a person, I still think people should approach things with skepticism regardless, just because I think it's just good practice. And I think it holds all supplements to a higher standard, because the only way to really eradicate that or push it out or more into the kind of corner is by everybody to start asking those questions and doing those things. On the practical end, I'll say in a perfect world, of course, we'd all get those governed body third-party safety checks, which is like NSF and then I forget what the other one is, but the reality is you're talking about staying within a certain price point. That can be a challenge because it is a pretty large added cost. I think a lot more than people would imagine. And so it depends on volume, but per product, you're talking anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000 per run to add that cost on. So it is going to inflate the price point. So now you're talking about, am I pushing myself out of the range to even stay afloat as a company just so I can keep up with the check market or the check mark? That's a challenge. So ways that I've tried to sort of meet that is I bought my own equipment. I bought my own FTIR, which is it's a qualitative test, so I can tell that something is pure. So whenever we're looking for a new manufacturer for raws, I'll have them send me the raw first. I'll make sure it lines up with the FTIR spectrum of an analytical standard. So then I don't even have to ask the question once it goes to our manufacturer, are they getting the right or wrong ingredient? Because the reality is the manufacturer does a microbioassay to make sure it's not growing mold or anything like that, but they don't do a quantitative test. So like I said, I start earlier in the chain, and then once we have a finished run, we've sent it out to Chromadex in the past, but there's so many other analytical places. But we're testing for potency. So we're testing to make sure our run matches the label claim. And in doing that, we are cross-checking our manufacturer, but also our product to make sure that they're telling us the truth too, and that they're mixing to spec, not just that the GMP is keeping them to spec. So that's sort of the way that we've been doing it to make it work. Ideally, I'd love to get to NSF or the other check marks, but like I said, you're paying for that process. And the other part is you pay per screen and per test. So let's say you want to test for, I don't know, let's just say some type of SARM that's not covered in the banned substances screen. That's another added fee on top of it. So it can add up like almost to the point where your testing will cost more than running the product. So it's basically just taking a shot at a macroscopic view of, okay, what can I control before it ever gets to the manufacturer? What can I control after it's run to do QC? And then the nice part is we have all of our athletes are drug tested. So it's like, okay, even if you wanted to be totally neurotic and said, I don't trust that test, every single person that that's been urine and blood tested, we've never had an issue. So, like I said, it's doing as much as we can before we can reach that point where it's, the $10,000 per batch. It's a scalability issue.
Yeah.
Right. Let me ask you a question, Ben. Would it be a viable strategy for a company to have the competitive athlete line of their supplements, or is there a problem because it comes from the same manufacturing and sources to where you could have, all right, this is marked up 10%, 20%, maybe even 25%, but what you're paying for, and we're marketing it that way so you know it, is to have that NSF check. Is that a viable strategy? Could a company do that? Because I know personally I would pay more to have that peace of mind.
I think a lot of people would. Yeah, I think if you can afford it, for sure. And I know that there's some brands that do that now. So it seems to be, again, it all comes down to money.
Right.
Can you afford it?
Going back to our previous conversation, unfortunately, Eric, when we spoke, we had the supplement company roundtable, and that's the honest truth. Like, I could totally sympathize with Ben. It's like doing it right, so to speak. It's like you're not balling. When you talk about these things, Ben, they could truly be prohibitive, cost prohibitive. Whereas like it's like, do you want to do that? Absolutely. Do I want to do that? For instance, with Ouroboros, totally. It's like, but because it is currently priced to be competitive against pre-workouts that basically have no creatine, have 2 grams of citrulline. It's like we have the full dose of everything, 30 servings as opposed to 20. It's like, and we're going dollar for dollar against basically sugar water. And then we're going to get, the third party testing. It's like, well, we went from making out, I'm joking, like $10 per bottle down to $3. Like, guess what? This is no longer a viable business. Like, you corner yourself, Eric, essentially. And I can't help but lament slightly that not that we're preaching to the choir with Iron Culture, but just how, we're in our own niche here. Like, we got myself and Ben here, we got T-Rex, we got Helms. I'm going to keep this very vague because I don't want this to be slander. And T-Rex is like, don't worry, man. I have that lawyer, Rick Collins, is like, these are the right words. I remember speaking to a guy before. Yeah, it's not loopholes. It's exemptions. And you don't say, I think one of the words you could say is BS. Like you can't say, there's certain words you can't say when you're attempting to criticize a company. So I guess T-Rex, what I'll say is I'm aware of a company that I visited and I interacted with some of the people in a certain part of America, let's say that is very much in almost, let's say, the Joe Rogan clique, where it's like, keto, like where he'll just say like keto. And this isn't an insult to Joe. Like I'm not trying to cast shade. I'm just talking about, people like Ben's example, trying to do right, weighing all these very heavy options on his head. Like what's best for the consumer? Like how should I balance this? What would make it more soluble? Like these very weighty questions on your head to try and make the best possible product for your consumer. And then I witnessed firsthand, and that's why I just brought up Joe, because people might understand more that niche or that side of the space, which is a very large one, which is almost, I'm not going to call it counter science, but it's like, oh, they don't want you to know something. Like I use keto, like there's the establishment where there's, they tell you to eat carbohydrates. My athletes, bro, they use keto and they actually perform better. It's like, hey, cool. But no joke, some of the stuff, there was someone that was chief of human optimization. So I'm keeping everything super vague here. No degree whatsoever. And I'm not saying Eric wants. I'm not trying to
That's amazing.
Yeah, Eric.
That's literally the carbohydrate acronym. But go ahead.
I didn't even realize it. That's amazing. Yeah, is a CHO. I was gonna say that with these individuals, I'm not trying to be a snob. It's like, where's your degrees at or whatnot? But like when you're trying to manufacture something or the intentionality behind your product, it's kind of like they say do this, we're going to do this. It's like, we're going to find, they were speaking about trying to obviously legalize ayahuasca and all these other things and have their own, pet research studies where it's going to be self-funded. And again, we got into all the problems like Trexler and Helms was saying about some of these things, some of these moral or ethical dilemmas. But this is a company that I heard, let's just say the amount of revenue they're generating or their consumers is like, compared to myself and Ben, and I'm not trying to go woe is me here, but it's of a magnitude, bro, Ben, of like 50 or 100 times. You know what I'm saying? So it's like what they're reaching and how little thought they're actually putting into their end consumer of all the things you just listed of quality control is astounding. So for an outsider, and that's why I just quickly, the small lament is that it's like those that could most benefit from hearing some of these things are those not inside this current niche. You know what I mean? It is the others.
They would be the ones who can afford doing it best too. That's the great irony in all of this.
Bet 100%. Yeah, it's crazy. It's sad, and by just essentially positioning yourself, so to speak, like we're not like the establishment where it's all marketing. It's like you immediately grow this audience, and you have one guy just say on a platform, "Yeah, but my athletes perform better when they do keto, though," and you're like, oh, like that. It's like a body of evidence, hierarchy of evidence. Like no,
body is not a textbook.
yeah, you could say those lines, those big buzzwords. Sorry, T-Rex.
No, I was going to say, Omar, I literally have no idea who you're referring to here, but I do want to be candid. You mentioned they're making 50, 100 times more than you. If they wanted me to formulate their multivitamin, I'd drop everything and do it.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, obviously, it's not due to the financial situation or consideration. It's merely that they have the ability to carry out what you envision because they have the financial resources. It's not what they can compensate you. It's just that your vision can be actualized through, their wealth.
Yeah, I like that response. Like, I'm not going to confirm that because I absolutely would do it for the money and I would sell my soul for a Lamborghini.
I was just being sarcastic, saying like, hey, if they need a multivitamin, it seems like they can afford my hourly rate.
Yeah, that's right.
But of course,
they're not going to send me
free
creatine. They'd send me $50,000. It's a little different.
So they wouldn't Helms. They wouldn't call it, of course, because they got to signal differently. They wouldn't call it a multivitamin. They'd call something else like a polyvitamin. And it's like, well, what's the difference between these? Well, guys. Well, wait. We need to explain this to you. Okay.
It's the polynutrient, the paleo poly. That's what they call it. Yeah.
The matrix, the polynutrient matrix.
Oh man,
I love it.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot, and whenever that happens, I always like to circle back and make sure that the true experts who are on, which is never myself and Omar on a given topic, have felt that we've covered all the relevant stuff for people who want to get this kind of behind-the-scenes look at both the research and formulation side of the supplement world. So let me open it up first. Trexler, is there anything you think that was unspoken that is important?
No, I think we covered a lot of stuff. I think bringing Ben on was an excellent choice because I think he's forgotten more about supplements than I'll ever know. I thought this was a really fun conversation and very informative too.
I'm informed and overjoyed that you said that. Over to you, Mr. Esgro.
I have nothing to add. I think each time now we've covered more than I ever anticipated in very much a good way, and I think I'm impressed by you guys every time. So I just appreciate being on, and I'd say the same to you, Eric, as well. Both Erics and Omar. Yeah, I don't think what you said is true, but I appreciate the compliment.
It's true.
Yes, I will second that, my friend. So yeah, thank you so much for both being on. Dr. Trexler, where can people find you?
They can find me on Instagram at Trexler Fitness. Omar messages me every couple of weeks about how much he loves my Instagram content.
I actually do. Yeah, he's the content king. So most people, I just want to say, Trexler, that most people look down upon those as simply repost, but you add a swipe up function, which is just changing the game I'm in.
Mm-hmm.
I hope you give Helms trouble for that too, because he does a lot of reposting too.
But that's part of his charm, being anachronistic, whereas I just expect maybe slightly more.
Yeah, I've earned that spot. So, yeah. Okay.
Okay, but you can find me at Trexler Fitness on Instagram for brand new, fresh content you've never seen on another account. And you can also find me at strongerbyscience.com. And you can find me on the Stronger by Science podcast, which makes all sorts of exclusive lists for the top podcasts, as Omar mentioned at the very beginning.
And we'll edit that last part out. And Ben Esgro, where can people find you?
Same thing, Instagram. It's just at Ben Esgro. At DeNovo Subs is the brand, and then denovosubs.com. And I always do my best to try to keep up with messages on there, but just be patient because I don't love the gram.
How dare you? No, totally understandable. I think everyone gets it. I just want to thank you both from the bottom of our cultist hearts. And with that said, Omar, could you do us the honors of closing this one out?
Well, yeah, Eric, I'll just say in closing, hopefully one day we'll make one of those subjective lists, and it would just do much to probably bolster the confidence of this fledgling podcast and for the cult. But we know where the cult heart lies, so I just want to shout out both of the guests. I thought this was very informative. I thought it was a fantastic conversation. I'll make sure to link their IGs in the description. Make sure to check out that fresh content. If you want to leave a rating review on iTunes, it does help us out. We do our best to respond to comments on YouTube, should you want to leave a comment on YouTube. And we will be back every single Monday. The pandemic couldn't stop us. We're still here from now until eternity.